do like it when things actually work. It's quite nice. I'm becoming a real expert on this too. If you could actually see me here, I've got all sorts of fancy things going on. Phone holders and lights and all sorts of things. But normally I'm normally a bit more organized. Oops, that's not very good. Don't want to do that. Oh, sorry about that, guys. That's because I'm streaming on YouTube. It's doing it at the same time. So guys, you can go and make sure you got all your white wines out of the fridge and ready to go. And in 2 minutes, we will be up and running. Whoa. It's all happening today. We might not do the Instagram one. All right. So guys, how you're going on your Saturday? I hope you're doing well. Looks like the world's slowly starting to open up, which is nice. We're going to keep doing these virtual tasting though. We've had really good feedback, so don't worry if you got friends or family or something that want to do this, because they can still be in Perth or New Zealand or wherever they are and join us for our virtual tasting. So my name's Jeff. I'm the winemaker for Tractorless Vineyard. If you haven't heard about Tractorless Vineyard before, we're based in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales, so about an hour and a half south of Sydney. We run the vineyard all biodynamically, which means we're organic by default. And then we run sheep through the vineyard for the whole growing season, which reduces our tractor use by about 60%. And that's where the name comes from. So we're quite a little sustainable label. We do things like we use this special glass. This is low carbon glass. So it's about half the carbon of a normal wine bottle, which means it's a lot easier to ship around. Of course, we've got the sheep in the vineyard and the biodynamic. So we've got solar on the roof. And ultimately, I'd love to make a winery that's completely off the grid. So we're working on a bit of geothermal technology. And eventually, I think when the technologies around storage of energy with batteries and those sort of things advances a bit, that will be a really big difference when it comes to all the winemaking going off the grid. But let's get into the real reason we're here and try some wine. So we're going to start off with the Sauvignon Blanc. Can't really see it that well, can you? There you go, it's better. So Sauvignon Blanc. I'm actually not a massive fan of Sauvignon Blanc. I find it a little bit overpowering. I'm used to those big Sauvignon Blancs, I guess, we've tried from New Zealand. I just find that all that fruit at once is too much. And so I make this in a fumé style. And what that means is it's essentially an oak fermented Sauvignon Blanc. And what the oak does, it mellows out all those flavors. So you still see that passion fruit and lantana and those sort of characters you expect to get in a Sauvignon Blanc, but they're subdued by the oak and chilled out, so to speak. And I guess that suits my sort of winemaking technique, and the personality a bit is that more mellow sort of personality to the wines. And so that's why I make it in the fumé style. And funny thing about fumé style is it originates from the Bordeaux region of France, because the Sauvignon Blanc they make there has this real sort of flinty, matchsticky character about it. But and so when New World winemakers, and when I talk about New World winemakers, I'm talking about Australia, New Zealand, America, those sort of people. When we saw this, we thought it meant that they used a lot of oak in the ferment. And so now when we make Sauvignon Blanc with oak, we call it a fumé style. The funny thing is they actually, whilst you do use oak, most of those flavors, those flinty, matchsticky textures of traditional fumé wines is actually from the fruit. So it's a little bit confusing. But when we talk about a fumé style in Australia, what we're talking about is a Sauvignon Blanc that's predominantly made fermented in oak. And you see that in this. The other thing we do with our Sauv Blanc is a double pick. So we pick half of it at around about that 9 Beaumet level. And that, when I say 9 Beaumet, that's a sugar level. So 1 Beaumet, when it's fermented with yeast, will ferment to 1% alcohol. So it's a really nice sugar level because it's an easy conversion. So when we ferment half of it at that 9 BOMA level or 9% alcohol level, and that gives us that nice crisp green acid and that sort of lantana-y character to the wine. We then harvest about 2 weeks later, we harvest the second half at around about that 12.5 level. And that gives us that more passion fruity and tropical character we see in that wine. And then it's all fermented in older oak. And then that mellows out all the flavors. So then at the end of it too, you get those nice oaky textures and this sort of lingering sort of oaky edge to it as well. So it just adds a nice little element to it. If any of you, most of you people, when you're joining me on these tastings, you're lucky. I see photos afterwards of these great cheese spreads and charcuterie boards. And I thought, I'm going to do that too. So I tried that once. But I was trying to eat and talk at the same time. Didn't work so well. So I've had to get rid of the foot cheese boards for my end. But if you've got one in front of you and you've got like a nice Edam or Gouda there, that's a really nice match with this Sauvignon Blanc is the Edam Gouda. So nice, mellowed out, tropical and lantana-y flavor. It's a good example of how cold climate we are in Southern Highlands, and people don't realize it, how cold we are because of our closeness to Sydney. But to get those tropical characters in the wine, we do have to be quite cool. And some years we harvest after Tasmania, so we are quite freezing. And what that means is the varieties that suit well to this region, those similar varieties to Yarra Valley, Chardonnays, Grigios, Gris, Riesling, Pinot Noir. When we start to get into some of the reds, it's a little bit too cold here. So everyone in our cellar door, they always ask me, what's the difference between a Grigio and a Gris? So I decided we'd show you the difference. So next we're going to try our Grigio. Now, Grigio and Gris are both made from the same grape variety. They're both made from the Pinot Gris grape variety. Grigio is the Italian way of making it, and Gris is the French way of making it. So there's very different philosophies behind the winemaking process. Italians are very driven by the food that they're going to eat it with or drink it with. And so even though, we could say that they make the wine specifically to go with the food, that's not quite right, but it's definitely the food is very strong in their mindset when they're making the wine. We think of Italy, maritime climate, a lot warmer conditions down there and lots of seafood. So the Grigio, they're trying to make a wine that's going to go well with seafood. So it's a really nice steely, crisp, zippy style of wine that they're trying to make. So the first thing the Italians do to do that is they harvest it nice and early. A good way to remember it, Italians always in a hurry, so they're the first ones to harvest the grapes. So they harvested it around about that 11 to 12% alcohol. And at that early level of alcohol, we also see a higher level of acid, and that means we keep that freshness and crispness to it. The second thing about Italian winemaking is they're not afraid of oxygen at all. So what they do is actually, when I make this wine, I've got my tank of juice after pressing it off, and I actually get a bucket and I fill my bucket up and I tip it over the top of the tank. And I do that maybe, 10 or 20 times until all the juice goes brown with the oxygen. And then I do a really long, slow, cold ferment. And that oxygen helps give me that nice, crisp, steely palate. And then that sort of green appley character you get a little bit in that wine as well. So that oxygen really helps with that. And you'll see my favorite match for this wine down in the South Coast do these really nice little South Coast oysters, and they're really nice and sweet. And that is a beautiful match with this wine. So if you're lucky enough to have some oysters there, definitely give it a go for Grigio, because I think that's it's up there with one of my favorite food and wine matches. And so Italian style, crisp, zippy, goes well with seafood, that nice sort of minerally, steely palate. And then we're going to compare it to the French style. So guys, I'll talk a little bit about the wines, and at different stages I'm going to talk a bit more. So don't feel too rushed about having to jump to the next one as soon as I mention the Gris or the next wine along. So Pinot Gris is the French way. So as I said, they're both made from the Pinot Gris grape. Grigio is the Italian way of making it, and Gris is French style. So when we think about the Pinot Gris in France, most of it is up in Alsace, so on the French-German border. And so it's a lot cooler climate up there. The French winemaking philosophy is about creating a wine that stands by itself as its own wine. And so they're trying to create a wine that's big and soft and round and voluptuous. And, you know, so the first thing the French do is they're harvesting it a lot later. So whereas the Italians are sort of harvesting around about that 11 to 12% alcohol range, so it's nice and crisp, the French are harvesting around about that probably 13 to 14% alcohol. So it's a lot riper on the vine. Now, one of the first things you guys will see in your glasses is the color difference. I may even put a glass with you of this. I try not to taste too many with you because I've got lots of tastings today. I do back-to-back tastings, and so by the end of the day, if I have too many glasses, it's better than being at the winery though, because I don't have to drive home. But what you will notice, and you probably see it better than your glass and mine, is it's got this real bronzy color to it. And that's because Pinot Gris, as it gets riper, actually gets a bit of color. So when it's around about that 11 to 12% alcohol level, which is the Italian level, it's still green. It's still a white grape. There's no color coming in. As soon as we hit about 13% alcohol, 13 Beaumet, we start to see a little bit more color development in the skins, and we get a bit of a pinky color. Now, when the skins have that pinky color, out in the vineyard, we always get a dusty outside to the grape bunches. So with the red grapes, with that dusty outside, you still see the real red underneath because it's so strong. With the Pinot Gris, because it's just a little bit of pink underneath, when you look at the bunches from a distance in the vineyard, they look grey. And so that's where the name came from. Gris means grey in French. And so Pinot Gris is the Pinot variety that looks grey on the vines. And so that's because the French actually ripen it above that 13% alcohol. And so they get that grey colour in their variety. And as a result, you always end up with this sort of bronzy colour in the final wine. And sometimes in some warmer climates in Australia in particular, you can see a pinky edge to it as well as the colour develops a bit more, but generally it's around about that bronzy colour. The next thing you'll see is in your glass, and you won't be able to see it on the screen, but you'll definitely be able to see it in your glass, is around up here is this rim of white sort of liquid that's condensating and then dribbling down the edge of the glass. And we sort of talk about legs or wine legs. And what that is it's the volatile components in that wine. And volatile, I mean, it's the bits in that wine that evaporate at room temperature. And most of that is actually alcohol. So there's a small percentage that are flavor, like aromas and flavonoids, but most of it is alcohol that's coming out. And what, interestingly enough, if we were to analyze the Grigio and the Grigio actually has a higher percentage of aroma chemicals in it. But when you smell the Grigio and smell this Gris, you would, and I would swear that the Gris actually is more aromatic. What in fact is happening is all this alcohol that's coming out, because it's got much higher percentage alcohol, all this alcohol that's coming out of this wine, as it's coming out and evaporating, it's grabbing onto other flavors at the same time. So it's pulling all these other aromas out of the wine that wouldn't normally come out of it, which is why when we smell it now, it actually smells a lot more aromatic. And so it's funny that even though it's got a lower aroma number, there's a lot more aromas in that wine, more perceived aromas to us. And the final thing you'll notice when you taste it, and I'm going to taste a bit with you today, is that big, rich, fruity, voluptuous palate. And that comes down to the harvest difference and the winemaking. Because the other thing with the French is they're super afraid of oxygen. So where I said the Italians use lots of oxygen in their ferment, helps get that really steely sort of palate to the wine, the French do everything under carbon dioxide cover. And as a result, they're trying to preserve some more of that aroma. Because they're fermenting it at a slightly warmer temperature to get mouthfeel, you lose aroma from the grapes. So to counteract that, they do it all under carbon dioxide cover, which helps trap in the aroma a bit better. So, you know, it's really hard to imagine, and it's amazing to imagine that both these grapes, the Grigio and the Gris, or both these wines, are made from the exact same grapes, exact same vineyard, exact same block, even in the vineyard, just different winemaking techniques. And you know, it's a good example of what the winemaker and viticulturists do can do to create the final style of wine. One of the interesting things, and I guess one of the difficult things for us in Australia, is a Grigio or a Gris, they're non-defined styles. So the first thing that's difficult is, here I've got Grigio, here I've got Gris, and then I've got all the variations in between, and somewhere in the middle here I've got this mix match that's sort of not a Gris or a Grigio. So both from a stylistic point of view, we've got this range, but in Australia it's not defined on label law what we're allowed to call Grigio and what we're allowed to call Gris. And so if I'm to walk into a bottle shop in Australia and buy a Grigio or Gris, it's a little bit of a lucky dip. And I've worked for big companies before where we might make a wine that's 13% out of alcohol, out of Pinot Gris grape. And so that's, you know, it's definitely in that Pinot Gris style. And depending on what the marketers thought would sell better that month, they'd label it either Grigio or Gris. And that's because we don't have a clear definition of what's what in Australia. That is changing. So I think it was last year or the year before, they actually now, when I went to a wine in a wine show, I enter it either in a Pinot Gris class or Pinot Grigio class, whereas previously I'd put it in any grape made from the Pinot Gris variety, but now I put it in a Grigio Gris class. So if I was to put that Grigio into a Pinot Gris class, it would get 0 marks because it's not a Pinot Gris. And so this is the beginning of it to become law. So over the next 5 or so years, the wine shows will nut out exactly what makes a Grigio and what makes a Gris. And then from there, we'll see the flow on and probably into labeling law. And so it'll become a little bit easier for us in the bottle shop when we're trying to define the styles. But, you know, Gris, Grigio, Italian, zippy, crisp, clean. The French, big, soft and robust. Both Gris and Grigio, it's one of these, you know, it's always really difficult to find a wine that goes well with spicy food. And I find that these are, Gris and Grigio, are great go-tos. So for me, whenever I'm having like spicy food that's quite fresh, Vietnamese, Thai, that sort of thing, I go for the Grigio. Whenever I'm having spicy food that's a bit richer, like curries and that sort of thing, I usually go for the Gris. And so they're not a bad go-to for those more spicy foods. In actual fact, one of my favorite matches with the Pinot Gris is sashimi, but with wasabi sauce, and that wasabi spice goes really well with that Pinot Gris. So normally when I'm live, I ask everyone, who drinks Chardonnay? What do people think about Chardonnay? And I get a lot of feedback of, yeah, maybe a little bit of Chardonnay, I don't know. Not a big Chardonnay fan. And it's the same in the cellar door. And the funny thing is that without a doubt, Chardonnay is one of our biggest sellers in the cellar door. Across the whole of Australia, Chardonnay is always like one of the main grape varieties, white grape varieties, year after year. It's one of the biggest sold wines. So I have this theory that we're all closet Chardonnay drinkers. What I actually think is that Chardonnay had this really interesting evolution. We sort of went from the 70s and 80s where it was super oaky, and then we went to the late 90s or early 2000s where there was no oak at all. And now we're finding this nice balance. And I think most people sort of have a bad memory of either the oaky or fruity ones. And so when you say, do you drink much Chardonnay? They're like, oh, no, not really. But I think we've never made such great Chardonnay in Australia as to now, is because we're really finding this beautiful balance. And to me, the key with Chardonnay is balance. So I want to see a little bit of fruit. I want to see a little bit of the light's a bit hard on the labels, isn't it? Look at that on there. Look, you can get a slow reveal of the label. I want to see a little bit of oak. I want to see a little bit of butteriness. I want to see a little bit of fruit, but I don't want to see too much of everything. I want to see just a little bit of everything. And you know, Chardonnay So the Chardonnay is one of those varieties where it's almost like a blank canvas. You know, as a winemaker, it's a really fun variety to make because everything I do, every little thing I do, you can really taste in the end of the wine. But it makes it a really scary variety to make because if I do something wrong, it's really obvious. And so I guess we've been a bit scared of Chardonnay. I show people this and we get that nice balance of it. And the feedback I get is, oh, actually, that's really nice. I actually do like Chardonnay. And one of the key things I find in that is that nice little bit of butteriness. It's not too buttery. It's obvious, but not over the top. And it was in the, you know, I'm sure you remember those really buttery Chardonnays. And I think it was in the middle of the 80s that this famous wine writer said, oh, I'm so sick of these buttery Chardonnays. And that buttery flavor is actually really interesting. It's from a second ferment. So we put Chardonnays and red wines through two ferment processes. The first ferment is done with a yeast, and you start with the sugar, and the yeast ferments that sugar into alcohol. So it's probably one of the most important ferment parts of the whole process. The second ferment is actually done by a bacteria, and it ferments the malic acid. So the malic acid is the same acid as you find in an apple. So it's quite a crisp acid, and it ferments it to a lactic acid by a bacteria, and the lactic acid is the same acid you find in milk. So it's a lot softer, creamier acid. Now, a byproduct of this fermentation process is this buttery flavor. As I said, this guy in the 80s said, oh, I'm sick of these buttery Chardonnays. And so the companies that grow this bacteria started selecting against that buttery flavor. So nowadays, when I go out into the market and buy a commercially available strain of bacteria, it doesn't have any of this buttery flavor to it. So for lack of a better word, I found an heirloom variety of this bacteria, and we use 5% of it in our barrels. And that just gives us that little bit of buttery flavor without being over the top. And for me, you know, you can definitely see it in this wine. And so you can imagine if we used 100% of the barrels with this old school bacteria, it'd just be overpowering. So we only use 5%. Now, if any of you there have a really nice fromage dauphinois or a really triple brie or something like that, a really nice fatty creamy brie, that is a beautiful match for this Chardonnay. And it helps bring the buttery characters out of the Chardonnay, but it also lifts the fruit characters as well. So it doesn't throw it out of balance. So it's actually probably one of my favorite matches of the Chardonnay. But yeah, interestingly enough, it's now becoming more popular again. I think it's sort of come in and out of trend a bit, Chardonnays across time, but it's always been one of the biggest selling white varieties in Australia, beyond doubt. So next we go look at our rosé, and one of the first things you'll notice with our rosé are these cute little bottles. Now, these are 500 ml bottles, and these were designed because two people can drink a bottle over lunchtime and still be under the limit. So that's why we designed the 500 ml bottles. Unfortunately, I can't get them anymore. So one of you will have to be over the limit this now in the next couple of vintages. But the other thing you'll notice is the color, how dark it is. And dark rosés, not trendy at the moment. The trend at the moment are those really nice light Provence style rosés from the south of France. I've never been a big trend follower. One thing you will notice about all these wines is they all have a lot of texture to them. So I love texture in my wines. I want to taste it. I want to smell it. I also want to really feel it in the mouth. So I really want to feel those textural notes. And to get that texture, I need to leave the wine with the skins for a longer period of time. So a lot of people don't realize if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the pulp and the juice inside is actually white. So to make a red wine, I've got to ferment the skins with the wine to extract all that color out of it. To make a rosé, I leave it with the skins for a certain period of time until I get the flavor or the texture I want. So those Provence style, South France sort of rosés, they probably spend maybe 1-2 hours with the skins before they're pressed off. I leave ours with the skins until I start getting just there on my palate. When I start getting this nice furry feeling in the middle of my tongue there, I press it off. And that's usually about the sort of 10 to 12 hour mark. And so as a result, it's spent a lot longer with the skins. And so we get that quite dark color. Now, people in Australia, and they see that dark color, and predominantly they immediately think of Matoush Rosé, which is famous here. And they think it's going to be sweet, but this isn't sweet at all. This is a bone dry rosé. It's made from 100% Pinot Noir. So you get that really beautiful sort of strawberry characters from the Pinot Noir. And then you get that nice furry texture in the mid palate from leaving it. The skin's a bit longer. I made this wine. Originally, I was sitting on my deck. I was enjoying a charcuterie board and some antipasta, and I thought, geez, I need to have a Pinot Rosé to go with this. It would be a perfect match. So I made this wine. And so that is a great match for it. You know, to me, rosé is a bit of a warmer climate wine, a bit of a warmer temperature wine, sorry. But it's a lunchtime wine, you know, with some charcuterie and antipasta. So that's our rosé. We're going to move into our reds now. For me, we're in definitely red drinking weather down here. It's starting to get cold. As I said, we are quite cool climate. I was up going for a walk this morning. I think it was 3 degrees or something. So in the evenings, we're definitely into our reds. And I was actually sitting in front of the fire enjoying a big Barossa red. And I love big Barossa reds. I love the velvety tannins and the raspberry characters to them. But sometimes I feel that they're just a little bit heavy for me, a bit too alcoholic. You can only have a couple of glasses and I find them a bit heavy. So I wanted to make something that, you know, was a bit more delicate, but still had those sort of textures and those flavors of a nice Barossa red. And so I came up with the Lost Flock, and the idea was I can drink the bottle in front of the fire. And you'll notice there are old labels, and see if I can fix this light a little bit so you can see them. But you'll notice there are old labels. So that was before I could afford someone to draw on our labels and paint them up. But this is essentially a GSM. So it's Grenache, Shiraz, Mourvedre. It's also got a little bit of Merlot and Petit Verdot. And it's just a really easy drinking, everyday red. It's probably the red I drink the most of. It's definitely the red I take to dinner parties the most. You know, some people like Shiraz, some people like Merlot, some people like Grenache. So you take a blend, and everyone can find a flavor they like in that wine. So that's why I use it a lot for dinner parties and that sort of thing. Now, we call it the Lost Flock, and it comes back to our sheep. And the sheep have really changed the whole landscape for us in the vineyard. So traditionally, when you become a biodynamic or organic vineyard, you're making the decision purely on a philosophical point of view, because from a cost reason, it's actually a lot more expensive to make a biodynamic or organic wine, because there's so much more labor and intensity in the vineyard. And then when you sell it in the market, you know, a biodynamic wine in a bottle shop is really not worth more at the moment than a non-biodynamic wine. It doesn't achieve a greater cost and so a greater price. And so it's a very expensive decision to make in the vineyard. Now, when we introduced the sheep, originally we introduced the sheep to control the caterpillars. So the biodynamic philosophy says, if you have a vineyard that has insect problems, or not just a vineyard, if you have any insect problems on your land, then it means you don't have enough animals in there. So we started experimenting with sheep. You know, we tried Dorpers, we tried Merinos, we tried a lot of different breeds. We had a lot of grapes eaten in the time. You know, the Merinos are okay, but we used to have the bunches hanging here, and then these electric wires underneath. And that did a great job. It would stop the Merinos eating the grapevines. But geez, it's amazing when their power goes out, how much a Merino can eat in one day. So that didn't work so well for us. So we've lost a lot of grapes. And eventually we found the variety or breed called Hampshire Downs. And so they're an English breed. They're a little bit shorter than a Merino. They're a grazer as well as a Merino. So when I talk about a grazer, what it means is they don't like looking up. So they will feed within their feed zone, and they won't look out of their feed zone until they run out of food in their feed zone. So a merino, unfortunately, the grapevines sit about there on a merino. So the grapes are still just inside the merino's feed zone. Now the Hampshire Downs are only a little bit shorter, but all of a sudden the grapes are outside their feed zone. So what that means is, as long as we move them through the vineyard and make sure they've always got grass, they won't look up at the grapevine, and so they don't eat the grapes or the leaves. The other thing about these sheep are their roamers, and what that means is they don't flock; they spread across the whole vineyard. So you don't get any sheep camps, and you don't get any like the sheep tracks through the vineyards because they're spread out, which is great for the vineyard. It's a nightmare when I go and shear because I always miss two. So I've always got these two woolly sheep wandering around the vineyard. They must hide somewhere. I don't know what they do. But in the winery, I stack the wines according to the variety. So all the Shiraz are together, all the Merlot together, all the Grenache together. And these stacks were all over the winery, and it reminded me of the sheep all over the vineyard. So we call it the Lost Flock. And that's where the name of this wine comes from. But they really have changed our lives. So we've solved that caterpillar problem because of it. As a result, we've just had a huge cost saving because by default, which we weren't thinking of in the time, and I don't know why we weren't, the sheep eat all the grass. So one of our biggest costs in running a biodynamic or organic vineyard is managing the grass. And normally we have to either mow or cultivate under the vines every 2 weeks to control the grass. But now the sheep do that all for us. So as I said earlier, it's about 60% of our tractor use is now eliminated, which also is a huge labor cost eliminated. And now we're also getting really good at managing the sheep. And what we've worked out is once a year, we do this thing which is called leaf plucking. And what it is if you can imagine a bunch of grapes hanging down here and the leaves grow and the leaves cover the bunches, and we want the sunlight to penetrate the bunches. Because when that sun hits the bunches, one, it helps with our disease, but it also helps us with flavor development. So what we used to do is pay teams and teams of people to pick off all the leaves. Now, what we worked out is if we wait to the perfect time of the year, which is usually late January, when the berries are hard, early January, when the berries are hard and the shoots are lignified. When I talk about lignified is if we've got a young shoot and I grab the leaf and I pull it, I rip off the whole shoot. But if that shoot's a little bit older and it's lignified and I grab that leaf, it only rips the leaf off. So when we've got hard berries and lignified shoots, I leave the sheep in for an extra 2 or 3 days after they've run out of grass. They start looking up and they'll eat the leaves for us as well and do the leaf plucking. So they actually now, our biodynamic vineyards with the sheep are now actually our cheapest vineyards to run by far. And then on top of that, you add the fact that we now have wool that we can sell and meat that we can sell. So all of a sudden we've got 2 extra incomes off the same block of land, which is actually costing us less to manage. So by introducing the sheep into the whole system, it is completely changed the whole landscape for us. And it's really changed that. And I'm getting bigger and bigger companies getting in contact with us to find out what techniques and how we do it in the vineyard, because I believe it's going to be a bit of a semi-evolution in the industry about how we run our vineyards. Because what stopped a lot of big commercial vineyards from going organic and biodynamic is the cost. And now that we've created a system that makes it more cost effective, I'm sure we're going to start seeing the vineyards convert across a lot. So they've been a major change for us. I diverged from the wine a little bit there, but I always get excited about the sheep because they've changed our lives so much. So whilst the Lost Flock is probably the one that I drink the most of, it's not my favorite. My favorite is the Pinot. So this is my little baby, the Pinot. We're not meant to have favorites of our children, are we? So as you can see, I've been trying a bit more of it now that I'm doing these virtual tastings. I don't have to drive home after working in the cellar door. I love a great Pinot. It's one of the hardest grape varieties for a winemaker to make. It's sort of seen a little bit like the icon of winemaking. Because it's quite a light red, similar to Chardonnay, the little things you do in the wine are quite obvious in the end. And so it is easy to make a mistake and get them wrong and see it in the final wine. Whereas something like a Shiraz or Cabernet, it's got strong, robust flavors. And so those flavors overpower any winemaking mistakes you may or may not make. So in Australia, we're used to these beautiful, delicate style Pinots. You know, they remind me of ballerinas. They're sort of light and delicate, but they're complex and interesting. And I love that style of Pinot. We make a lot of it in Australia. And so I wanted to show people another style of Pinot. I wanted to show people a traditional, old school, funky Burgundian style. So this style of winemaking uses lots of whole bunches, uses lots of stems. It creates a style of Pinot that is big and funky and juicy, but is going to age really, really well. It's effectively made to age. So if you're lucky enough to have tried a lot of Burgundian style Pinots, this is kind of the style that you'd expect to see. And the problem with doing this style is it takes a long time to make. So when I put this in the bottle after the fermentation and pressing off and barrel aging, it's really bitter and resiny, and it actually needs about 3 to 4 years in bottle to soften out and ease and settle down until we release it. So I released this after 3 years. Still had a little hint of bitterness at the back palate here, but I drink a lot of coffee, and so I actually quite like that bitterness, so I didn't mind about releasing it. That bitterness is really settled down now and disappeared. You know, the French would say I should have waited for 4 or 5 years before I release it, but I didn't. But as I said, big, old school, funky style of Pinot. It's going to age really well. It's already getting little hints of that. I love that wine. It's already starting to get nice little hints of that cigar boxy forest floor character. And that's one of those great aged Pinot characters that you're trying to chase as a winemaker. And when I talk about cigar box, you know, I don't know if you've ever opened a cigar box, but it's got this real woody character, but the wood is like a nice sweet wood. It's not like a dry acrid wood. It's like quite sweet. And the same with forest floor. It's these spicy characters that are quite sweet spice. They're not like harsh dry spice. And so this is starting to age perfectly as I expect it to. And I'm definitely looking forward to drinking that over the next 10 or 20 years. The other thing you might notice is this is actually one of our most natural wines. You'll notice sometimes you get a bit of cloud in it or a bit of sediment in the bottle. It's because we don't filter the Pinot. It's all unfiltered. The other thing is it's a vegan. It's one of our vegan wines. Only by default, because I made it in a very old school traditional style where we didn't use egg or anything like that. And so it's vegan by default. But as I said, it's one of my favorites. I think I'm going to have to start drinking a bit more of it. Food matching wine, you know, Pinot is traditionally matched with duck and sort of gamey meat. And often when you get into the redder meats, those delicate Pinots that we're used to drinking, they don't have the goudos or the gusto to handle those red meats. I think because of the style of winemaking I've done, this is quite a big, funky Pinot, and I really like this matched with like venison. Actually, it's one of my favorite matches. I love that wine. The next wine we're going to taste is probably the most Australian wine that we make, and it's our Shiraz. You'll notice a slightly different label on these. This is our creator's label. So it's got the sheep on it versus the tractor. Now the difference is our sustainable series, which is the one with the tractor on it, is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. Whereas the creator's series is not necessarily 100% off our biodynamic blocks. So things like the Lost Flock, which is under the creator's series, it uses some of the varieties are off our biodynamic blocks and some of them aren't. The Shiraz, it's too cold in the Highlands for Shiraz. And so we use a grower who we've been working with a long time up in Hilltops. They grow the Shiraz up there for us, and then we make it into wine. I had to include a Shiraz. The first job I ever had when I finished school as a winemaker was with Clonakilla, and they're famous for their cool climate Shiraz. So this brings back so many memories of working there. Plus, you know, Australia was made famous within the wine world by Shiraz. Like, we were put on the wine map thanks to Shiraz. You know, initially it was those warmer climate Shirazes, and nowadays we're getting a lot of kudos for our cooler climate Shirazes. And this is, you know, this is a very typical cool climate Shiraz. If you got this as a cool climate Shiraz drinker, you would be very happy. It's got that nice plum and chocolates and that little hint of spice, but not too much. And then it's got that beautiful cool climate texture to it. And it's like a line straight down the middle of the tongue of this nice furriness, this structure. And it's one of my favorite things about cool climate Shiraz, because I find these warm climate Shiraz has all this amazing flavor and interest, but they sort of just go, whoa, there you go, there it all is, and they throw it at you. Whereas these cool climate wines, they have all this flavor and interest to them, but because of this structure down the middle, they sort of slowly hand you the flavor as it goes to the mouth, rather than giving it to you all at once. And that's one of the key things I love about cool climate Shiraz. And I think it's one of the two things that really define a great region for cool climate Shiraz. One is this beautiful structure with this line down the middle. And the second thing is the spice level. One of the biggest feedback I get with people tasting Shiraz is they go, oh, I really don't like Shiraz because it's too spicy. And when they try this, they go, oh, I actually quite like this because it's not too spicy. And I 100% agree. For cool climate Shiraz, you've got to be able to get that structure, and you've got to get a little bit of spice, but not too much. And I think Canberra, Young, and Heathcote are probably my three picks of cool climate Shiraz around Australia. And that's such a beautiful, typical Australian cool climate Shiraz. And one of the cool things about Shiraz from a winemaker's point of view in Australia is, you know, I've tried all these really different European, fancy Australian, like all these different techniques to make this wine. And every time the just stock standard, simple winemaking always ends up, I find, with the most elegant and balanced Shirazes. And that's, you know, we destem it, we ferment it without the stem, so about 3 weeks. We press it off into oak barrels for 12 months, goes into bottle, and then it's ready to drink. And it's very easy winemaking, but there's something about the structure and the fruit flavors of Australian Shiraz that as soon as you mess with these basic winemaking techniques, it doesn't destroy the wine, and it sometimes adds interesting elements to it, but it just is, it's just so nicely balanced and so nicely textured when you stick to these clean sort of techniques that I always end up going back to them. And so very cool climate, typical Shiraz. You wouldn't be unhappy with that if you picked it up at all. I'm going to start drinking a bit more of it. I love it. Every time I sit here and I drink it and have a glass with you guys, I think, oh, I'm going to drink more of that. I'm a huge fan, as you're probably getting the drift of. I love old wines. And I was really lucky when I went to uni that in my year at uni, I think there was about 15 of us. And then 2 years after me, there was about 200. So I sort of went through before it was like super trendy to be a winemaker. And as a result, our lecturers could bring whatever wines they had for us to taste, because they only needed one bottle for us all to taste. Whereas as soon as there was 200 people, they needed to make sure they had a wine that everyone could get a glass of. And my lecturer teaching me about wine evaluation at the time was a master of wine, Nick Bulliard, and he just got back from Adelaide, and he was telling the story how he was down in Adelaide and there was this old pub being knocked over, and he looked in the skip in the pub and he found this half bottle of wine, a 370ml bottle of wine. So he jumped in there and grabbed it out, and he brought it to uni, and we opened it. Anyway, it turned out to be a 1956 McGill's Burgundy. So the McGill vineyard is the Penfolds vineyard way back before it was Penfolds. Anyway, it was amazing. The flavors of this were, you know, and aged wine flavors have really weird descriptions. They're like soy sauce and fish sauce and, composting guava and that sort of thing. They don't sound great, but the way they work and balance with the fresh fruit flavors was incredible. And so I really wanted to make a wine that could age 50 years plus. And so around the world, the people that are famous for making wines that age really, really well is Bordeaux in France. And they created this technique they call post-ferment maceration. So we use it in our Cabernet. That's why we call it the post-mac cab sav. And what this technique does is when we're aging wines, there's two things that are a problem. The first thing is the fruit level. So if you imagine, we might have a normal wine of a fruit level here. And as we age that wine, the fruit level goes down and the savory level comes up. And when they're about the same, we hit this nice balance. And when the wine's in that balance, it might be 10, 20 years, something like that. That's a premium time to drink that wine. Eventually we lose the fruit and it comes out of balance. So if we want a wine that's going to age really well, we need to start with a huge amount of fruit. And so that way we hit this balance about here, which is around about that 40 to 50 year mark. And so one, we need this fruit balance. The other thing that happens with a really old wine is it can go through a process, or what happens to it, it's called cracking up. And cracking up is a really good description for the wine that's gone off this way. When you taste a wine, you feel it across your whole mouth. It fills the palate, it fills the tongue, and you can feel the flavors everywhere. Well, when a wine cracks up, it literally feels like this crack down the middle of the tongue where it's almost like water. It's like acidic water. It loses all its texture and flavor. And what that is a lack of tannin and structure in that wine. So, when you have a young Cabernet, it's got those sort of chalky, grippy, edgy tannins to it. Those tannins are short chains. And when I age that wine, those short chains join into a long chain, and a long chain is nice and soft and velvety. That's one of the good things that's happening in a wine when you age them. But let's say I start with 100 of these short chains in a bottle, and they age, and we get 50 of these long chains, and then they age a bit more and they join up to 25 of these even longer chains. Well, 25 tannins is not enough for the structure. And so that's when we lose the structure and we get this cracking up in the palate. So this post-ferment maceration technique, firstly, it gives us huge amounts of fruit, but also, because you've got all the skins and stems sitting in that tank for a long period of time, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these short chain tannins floating around in this tank. And what it does whilst it's in the tank, it pushes them together into long chain tannins. So when I bottle that wine, I'm bottling that wine with 100 long chain tannins rather than 100 short chain tannins, which means I've got more stable longevity of structure for that wine. So I end up with a wine that's super fruity and soft velvety tannins, these long tannins. Now, I have no idea how the French work this out, because when you follow this technique, the wine does not taste fruity and it does not taste soft and velvety, that's for sure. So what happens is you get to about the 3-month mark and the wine starts to taste really bitter and terrible and resiny. And interestingly enough, at that mark, I started calling around all the old school winemakers I know and all my winemaking friends in Australia to ask, have you used this technique? What was the result? Pretty much everyone I've talked to got to 3 months and pressed it off. And then, because it's still a little bit better, but it's only a bit and you can save the wine. And I almost did that. So I still to this day don't know anyone that's gone beyond 3 months in Australia. And so I made the decision at 3 months, you know what, I'm going to do it. The textbooks say this and anecdotal evidence in France says this, I'm going to do it. And so I left it with the skins for 18 months. So 12 to 18 months is where they often do. And guess what? Didn't look any better. So after 12 to 18 months, granted, it was a lot less bitter, but it still wasn't fruity. It was stemsy and resiny, but a lot less bitter. I put it in a barrel, didn't really improve that Stemsy. I couldn't get any fruit flavor. I put it in the bottle, and it was about 18 months out of bottle, and the fruit flavor just went, absolutely blew me away. I just could not believe the level of fruit that was in that wine after 18 months. And it just came from nowhere. And I have no idea how the French worked it out, but it just had this really intense, like cassis, capsicum, tomato leaf sort of characters to the wine. And for me at that stage, after 18 months in bottle, it was too fruity. It was like a New Zealand Sauv Blanc. You know, they just have that intense fruit. It was too much for me. And now it's 4 years in bottle, and when you smell that now, you get that really intense capsicum, cassis, tomato leaf. You still get that, but it's just settled down enough. So now I've started drinking this one. So it's 4 years in bottle. I've started drinking it, but it still really smells like a young Cabernet. It's got those huge amounts of fruit. It's got this nice soft velvety tannin. So in theory, it's doing exactly what it should do for this technique. And I say in theory because, as I mentioned before, I don't know anyone else has used this technique in Australia before to this level. This wine for me is a perfect match for roast lamb. I'm really now excited to taste this wine every 5 years. And, you know, we might all get back on one of these Zoom webinars in 50 years time, and I can tell you whether this technique worked well or not, because I won't really know until we've actually done it, because no one else has done it. So that's our post-mat Cab Sav, and doing everything I hope it will do. I'm excited. That's definitely going to be one to put in the cellar. That and the Pinot, the two to put in the cellars. You know, I'm hoping I really want you guys to be able to experience old wines with me, because it's something that you don't get to experience so much in Australia unless you've got a friend or family member or yourself who actually ages wine. So we hold back a lot of our wines that I think are going to age well, and we'll release them at a later date to our wine club members and that sort of thing. And so I'm going to put a link up now into the chat in case anyone's interested. So I'm just going to put a link up in the chat now with our club memberships and where you can buy things and that sort of thing. So yeah, aged Cabernets, if you're like me, don't try aging the wine in your house, because I always have a glass or two and end up in the cellar, and I don't age anything. So it's got to be a long way for me. Don't age it in your father's house either. That didn't work so well for me either. But yeah, that's an exciting one to age. So guys, we've got one more. So I hope you don't mind. I'm going to go a little bit over our 1 hour, but I hope that's all right, because I started a little bit late. So I'm going to excuse myself. So this last one we're going to try is called 8,000 Vintages. And 8,000 Vintages, the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6,000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. And if you're into history at all, there's a really great book called Ancient Wine, and it talks about how they prove the oldest record of winemaking in the world. And essentially what they did was they found pottery shards, and they could carbon date the pottery shards, and they carbon dated these shards at 10,000 BC. And they found on the inside of the pottery shards tartaric acid. And the only fruit in the world that makes tartaric acid is grapes. So they knew grapes had been stored in here. They then found close by these piles of grape seeds, and the grape seeds were fat and round. And if I take a wild grapevine and I cultivate it and propagate it and look after it, the grape seeds go from long and round to fat and round, long and skinny to fat and round. And so they knew that farmers had deliberately grown the grapes. They knew that they had deliberately removed the seeds and stems and put them in these pottery shards with just the juice. And so it's the first tangible record of winemaking in the world. And interestingly enough, there's a famous statue in Georgia of a guy drinking out of a sheep horn, and that's the traditional way to drink wine in Georgia, and that's dated at 10,000 BC. But they can't prove that he was actually drinking wine out of the sheep horn. So there's anecdotal evidence that maybe white winemaking's been around for a lot longer, but at the moment, 6000 BC is where the oldest record winemaking sits. And the Georgians make a famous red style they call Kinsmorali, and it's very famous over in Eastern Europe, and Georgia and Russia, and in particular, in 2002, I think it was, when Georgia and Russia had a little bit of a battle with each other, and Georgia wasn't allowed to export anything to Russia. Russia put an embargo on any imports, and it was still our biggest market. And we used to smuggle Kinsmorali across the border on the school buses, and so it's that famous over there. And we make this style that's similar to Kinsmorali here. It's not a true Kinsmorali because it's not from the Kinsmorali region, but it's very true to style. And we get a lot of Russians and Eastern Europeans making here. And I was lucky enough, I spent 7 years actually in Georgia. I do 6 months here, 6 months there for 7 years. So this is my homage to the history of wine. It's my homage to Georgia. It's our Australian version of Kinsmorali, which we call 8000 vintages. So it's quite a unique flavor. You probably haven't tried anything like it before. It's a really good match for that, a smoky American style barbecue, or a mature cheddar, or a really dark chocolate as well. It's a really good match for this. But it's quite an interesting wine. And I think the style originated because in Georgia, it's quite warm in summer, but then it gets quite cold, as in it snows over winter. And Saperavi is quite a late ripening variety. So I think what happened was they'd harvest these grapes and they'd put them in quarries. And a quarry is their traditional, it's like a big amphora that's buried under the ground. So it's a big pottery sort of vessel, about 3,000 litres, that they make the grapes in. And so I'd say they put all the grapes in there and they started fermenting at the end of summer. Then it started to snow and winter came really quick, and it stopped the ferment before it finished. So you ended up with a little bit of this residual sweetness. And I think that happened year after year, and people love that style. And so now it's become the famous style there. And now it's actually appellation controlled. It's controlled by law how this style is made. And so I've followed those appellation, those legal requirements over there. Not a true Kinsmorali because it's not from the Kinsmorali region, but very true to style. And so I hope you enjoy that one. It's a nice one to end on. So guys, that's all the wines we've got for today. I hope you enjoyed it. When I do finish up eventually, I will leave the chat going for a bit. So if you have any questions, if you haven't been on Zoom before, there's a little chat thing down the bottom. You can please ask any questions. I've put some links up there. I'd love you to follow us on Instagram, YouTube, those sorts of things. We're going to keep doing these. I know we're sort of opening up again now, and people will, I think we're allowed to do tastings soon, but I'm going to keep doing these ongoing because the feedback we have has been fantastic. But, to be able to sit on a Saturday afternoon in your house with not having to travel to another region and not having to leave the house and organize drivers and things and taste a range of wines, I think we're definitely going to keep doing this. I'm planning a sparkling session. Unfortunately, I can't put the sparkling wines in the little bottles, but in the next few weeks, we're going to launch a sparkling add-on. So we'll probably do this, and then for another half hour or so afterwards, we'll do a sparkling wine, and we might do one sparkling wine a week across 6 weeks or something like that. So we'll launch all that on our Instagram and Facebook. So make sure you're following us. Of course, there's a link there, and you all got a voucher for a bit of a discount to buy our wines. We would love you to buy some bottles. We do these tastings, which is great, but it doesn't make us huge amounts of money. So we'd love you to buy some wines. And guys, stay in contact. Please come and visit us someday. If you're in a regional area, if you're not in a region area, please, we tell you to go out and please make sure you support your local producer. I know it's a little bit of hard work for people, and I'm the same. The extra 10 minutes to not shop at a big chain and to go to a local producer is really going to change a lot of small producers' lives. And so I sort of handed over everyone to please go and support local and make an effort on that front and help us all. So guys, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, I'm going to keep the chat going for a while. if you have any questions, please chuck it up there, and hopefully we'll see you soon down in the Southern Highlands. So see you later, guys. Have a great Saturday.